Good morning, everyone. My name is Zaina Al-Shaib. I'm the Director of Digital Communications here at the Middle East Institute. I'd like to welcome you all to this on-the-record briefing session in which we'll discuss the ouster of President Bashar al-Assad from power in Syria. As a Syrian American, it's surreal for me to be uttering that sentence. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad fled Damascus from Moscow on December 8th, bringing an end to 54 years of Assad family rule. The Assad regime collapsed in the face of a surprise rebel offensive led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, an Islamist group with former ties to al-Qaeda. This unexpected turn of events follows a lengthy stalemate in the Syrian civil war and comes on the heels of recent geopolitical changes in the region, triggered by the Israeli war on Hezbollah and Russia's distraction with Ukraine. What are the domestic and regional implications of this tectonic transformation in Syria? We're lucky to be joined by Ambassador Ryan Crocker, career diplomat with the U.S. Foreign Service. His previous appointments included U.S. Ambassador to Syria, Iraq, Pakistan, Kuwait, and Afghanistan, and Lebanon, as well as Charles Lister, Senior Fellow and Director of MEI Syria and Countering Terrorism and Extremism Programs. Thank you both for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
When we get to the Q&A portion, you can use the raise hand function on your screen to ask a question, and if you're called on, we will unmute you and you could direct your question to our panelists. Questions can also be written in the Q&A chat box here on Zoom. Let's get started. I'm going to turn to Ambassador Crocker first. Ambassador, you served as ambassador to Syria when Bashar al-Assad came to power. In a matter of days, his regime fell. What is your take on the speed of the collapse of the regime and the implications for Syria?
Well, the implications for Syria will be a long time in playing out. This is just the beginning of a true revolution, and its impact is yet to be felt. It will be significant, both in Syria, obviously, and in the region. I was ambassador to Syria when Bashar formally took power, and I had the opportunity to meet him several times in the last year of his father's life at the request of Hafiz al-Assad through the foreign ministry. I didn't quite know why I was being asked to meet with him. We had 2 or 3 lengthy one-on-one sessions that covered the waterfront. But I came away from those conversations with a strong feeling that the Western notion prevalent in the period just before he took power, that because he could turn on a computer and had postdoctoral studies in the UK, that he was somehow a Western liberal in waiting. My conversations told me exactly the opposite, that he was incredibly doctrinaire, a true advocate of the Ba'athi hardline, without his father's flexibility, wit, or acute intelligence. So my conclusion, even before he took power, was that this was not going to be a new era for Syria. It was going to be a continuation of the old one, with perhaps even less flexibility and more brutality.
Wow. And what caused his sudden collapse, and where were his 2 greatest allies in his time of need, both Russia and Iran?
Well, my take on it is that it was a combination of factors. Certainly the external support that he had had so critically a decade ago that kept him in power from both Iran and Syria was not there. Iran, of course, has suffered major setbacks with the Israeli actions against Hezbollah in Lebanon and the strikes directly on Iran, as well as the defeat in Gaza of its ally Hamas, and the Russians clearly preoccupied with Ukraine. But, and I will defer to Charles on this, I think it's more complex than that, that pretty clearly now, in retrospect at least, that the Syrian establishment had hollowed itself out, that rampant corruption, poor leadership of the armed forces, a lack of a long-term strategy on the part of Assad had severely weakened morale, readiness, preparedness, and willingness to fight on the part of the Syrian military. So I think it's a combination both of internal weakness and the collapse of external support, again, faced up against a coalition led by HTS that had been getting ready for this fight for a very long time.
Thank you, Ambassador. Charles, what's your reading of the events of the last 2 weeks in Syria? You're muted.
First of all, I feel like I should be asking you that, Zaina, rather than myself. But I mean, yeah, it's a extraordinary, profound change, as you say, 54 years on. This is a new world for almost every Syrian alive today. 54 years is a very long time to have lived the same reality. So, first of all, for Syria, it's gigantic. Geopolitically, it changes the map in the Middle East. Which is perhaps a different conversation for today, but a huge loss for Iran, depending on what happens for Russia, potentially a very significant geopolitical loss for Moscow too. But yeah, as Ambassador Crocker was saying, I think the regime had been decaying from the inside for a very long time. And I think that decay set in, ironically, post the 2020 ceasefire that the Turks and the Russians had negotiated. So the semblance of calm and a lack of pressure, I think, allowed that decay to set in and the rot to really make an effect. That plus the absolute collapse of the Syrian economy meant that the only thing that was holding Syrian conscripts into the Syrian military was money. It wasn't loyalty to the regime. It certainly wasn't loyalty to Bashar. And the moment that a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel appeared, those front lines collapsed one after the other. And you could watch it, play out. I mean, Homs fell because Deraa rose up. It wasn't because HTS broke through the battle lines in Homs. It was because Syrian soldiers just gave up the moment they knew that the game was finished. So I think there's a lot of, in retrospect, sort of thinking to be had about the miscalculation that the entire international community had on Syria. If you were, the Arab states believed that Bashar not only had survived, but was getting stronger, and that therefore it was the time to re-engage. And the West side of the international community, I think, believed that the regime wasn't necessarily particularly strong, but that it wasn't going away anywhere. And that the significant majority of the Syrian people had come to accept that. And that was just profoundly wrong too. So I think there's, a lot of lessons to be learned about paying a lot more attention to some of those more granular signs that I think were beginning to appear on the ground inside Syria. That, yeah, there was still a thirst for some change, but that something had to give to open up that. And that's exactly where this offensive that started on November the 27th, I think, started to change those equations.
Absolutely. So, Charles, Damascus is now in the hands of jihadis led by Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. He was once affiliated with both Al-Qaeda and ISIS. What are your views about Jolani and HTS, and how will they fill this power vacuum?
So it's a very complicated question with a complicated answer. HTS is a group that has gone through an extraordinary transformation. As someone who wears two hats, if I put my counterterrorism program hat on, the way that this group has evolved is virtually unprecedented in that world. The extent to which rhetoric comes out from that group around outreach to Christians, Alawites, Kurds, Druze, minority communities is simply not something that you hear from a jihadist group anywhere else in the world. So I think to an extent the ideological change is real. It's not also, by the way, new. It started in 2015. So the path that we're seeing here is just the end of a path that started a really long time ago. And Jabhat al-Nusra, the original root of this organization, had only existed for 3 years before that. So 3 years versus 8, there's been a lot of change. Whereas the early roots, no question, extremely problematic. But I think it's important to set that into some context. So for the past 4 years, HTS has had a constant line of communication with the Christian community in Idlib. It has been quietly engaging with a number of core European governments on political issues. It has, again, behind closed doors, played a role in a number of European and Central Asian counterterrorism operations and interests and deportations from northwestern Syria. So there's been a lot playing behind the scenes that I think has driven this group in this direction, which again is purely self-interest. I think Jolani realized that the only way to maintain credibility and relevance inside Syria was to chart a particular path. Once that showed some success, he simply continued on that journey. And he is on a single-minded path here, not just for his own significance, but to remain the kingmaker, and that's what we're starting to see play out. Another sort of retrospective thing is I've known several dozen Syrians of his background who grew up as they're in their late teens, early 20s when the Iraq War started, and were thrust into that kind of, join the resistance, fight the Americans, fight the occupiers, and subsequently went on to continue the global jihad elsewhere. Know many of them who went to Chechnya and Bosnia and Afghanistan and all kinds of other places. And the experience of coming back to Syria in 2011 or 2012 to fight for their homeland had either almost instantly or over a period of time this somewhat transformative effect, not their personal beliefs, but how those were directed inside Syria. So I don't also personally think that some of the change is not genuine. I think some of it actually is. My main concern with HTS, though, isn't ideology. It's the dictatorial practices, which they haven't given up any of those in Idlib over the last 5 years. So I'm not concerned about global jihad. HTS is not going to be making peace with Al-Qaeda and ISIS anytime soon. But I am concerned at their dictatorial nature. And the early signs in Damascus are good in the sense that it's stable, but they're not good in the sense that the transition is being entirely led only by this group. And that's the big challenge lying ahead.
Thank you, Charles. Ambassador Crocker, let's talk about Israel for a little. Israel has stepped into this power vacuum and seized control of a demilitarized buffer zone in the Golan Heights. They bombed military sites in Damascus. I'd like to hear your take on Israel and its concerns.
Well, that remains to be played out, doesn't it? What Israel has as its long-term strategy with this new order or disorder in Syria. The occupation of the demilitarized zone set up after the 1973 war may have repercussions beyond which the Israelis intend. Again, if this is a measure to ensure that truly militant revolutionaries don't take up positions right adjacent to Israeli lines, that will be one thing. But if they are contemplating a long-term occupation of more Syrian territory, that could add fuel already to a fire. And again, we don't know a great deal about Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, but his choice of his nom de guerre, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, the Golani, suggests he may have some interest in what happens in the Golan region. So it's the Israelis, in presumably taking preemptively defensive moves, need to be very careful that they don't spark a new militancy directed at them.
Absolutely. Charles, I want to talk about something you've brought up on Twitter several times. What is Turkey's relationship with HTS, and what kind of influence do you expect them to have?
Yeah, so this is obviously a very important question, but it's also not one that's very easy to sort of explain. Turkey has a relationship with HTS. It's primarily through its intelligence service, MIT. Technically speaking, and on paper in Turkey, HTS is still designated as a terrorist organization. So that has genuinely restricted the extent to which the rest of the Turkish state has been able to even communicate with HTS, which is why it's primarily run through the intelligence channels. Turkey has its own, as it does across the rest of northern Syria, its own national security interests are the primary priority. Those are, and have been for a long time, stability, in other words, preventing refugees from fleeing towards Turkey, and preferably seeing refugees return into northern Syria, and secondarily, counterterrorism. And for both of those reasons, HTS's rule of Greater Idlib has proven over the last 4 or 5 years to be the best of all potential evils, in that it has been far more stable in terms of governance than northern Aleppo, where the more moderate nationalist Syrian National Army operates. That's a region that's just rife with constant instability, assassinations, organized crime, drug smuggling, you name it. Everything is in northern Aleppo. Idlib, on the other hand, has been far more stable, more effective governance, much less insecurity. And if you look at the way that Syrian refugees returned from Lebanon over the last several months amidst war in Lebanon, many thousands of them returned to Idlib. That sends a sort of signal about the relative stability that Idlib represented compared to other regions of the country. Turkey liked that. Not saying that they necessarily liked the group and what it stood for, but they like stability on their border. Militarily, Turkey has roughly 75 military posts ringing around Greater Idlib region that HTS has been controlling for the last 4.5 years. Those posts aren't there to protect HTS, in that they are there to protect a ceasefire that was agreed between Turkey and Russia in early 2020, and again, to prevent a massive return of instability. So HTS maintains some influence over, Turkey maintains some influence over HTS, but it's not control. That I think is to be distinguished. The idea that this was a Turkish planned, Turkish directed offensive is nonsense. And there's significant background to this, in that HTS had been obviously planning to do something like this for a long time. Jolani has put it in his, or Ahmed al-Shara, as he now wants to be called by his real name, has been making it clear for years that Aleppo and then Damascus was on his agenda. But the offensive that we saw launch on November 27th was originally planned to take place around October the 10th. And at that point, the Turks, the MIT, found out about it and instantly put a stop to it. And within hours, interestingly, Russia's Air Force had taken to the skies of Idlib for the first time in about 4.5 months and conducted a 4-day bombing campaign, hitting every single front line. And so I still think too much of a coincidence that somehow Turkey's recognition of the plans were then passed to Russia to send a message. There were then a number of conversations between HTS and its military coalition and Turkey about the desire to deter aggression from the regime. And that was the term used to call the offensive that was launched in November. That term, Operation Deter Aggression, was agreed in October for the initial date, as were all the social media profiles HTS has used to coordinate dissemination of information about this offensive. They were all established in October. So I think really what we saw happen was Turkey didn't really want this because they feared it would trigger major instability on its border. But HTS ultimately knew what it wanted to do from the outset. None of those actors and nobody else knew that the regime would collapse in the dramatic way that it did. This wasn't an offensive that was intended even to take Aleppo city. That just happened because that was the momentum that was created on that first day. The initial objective was much more limited.
HTS's weaponry and everything is coming from where? Turkey, right?
I don't think we've even seen evidence of that. I mean, HTS was the tip of the spear of major offensives for years and years and years. And what it did was squirrel away all of the seized weaponry. I mean, truckloads of weaponry in 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. There's huge cave complexes in Idlib into which those weapons were hidden and concealed for years. The Russians have bombed some of them, but many of them not. So I don't think, again, we've seen any evidence that large quantities of weapons have been provided from the outside for this offensive. No doubt HTS has been running a very significant black market weapons trade with the regime or with regime figures for years. And so it may very well have been purchasing ammunition from regime sources across line trade routes. But I don't think there's a reason to believe that there's been some significant kind of importing of weaponry to back this. The one exception is the drones. The HTS have had an entire drone fleet. A lot of them have been indigenously manufactured with 3D printers and all kinds of other things, but motors for every single one of those drones will have been purchased from abroad. And so there's some questions to be asked about how they sourced things like that. But we haven't seen fleets of tanks and armored vehicles arrive from outside or anything like that. This was more of a locally driven thing.
Ambassador Crocker, how do you assess this moment in Syrian history, and maybe outline for us some of the challenges you see facing Syria today?
Well, the difficulties of predicting the future are notorious. My idea of an extreme long-range prediction in Syria or elsewhere in the Middle East would be about a week from Thursday. But what I can say with some confidence is what I believe is not coming. And what is not coming to theaters near us anytime soon is a rules-based democratic order founded in respected and stable institutions. Syria hasn't got any of those. And has not had any for a very, very long time, if ever. And as we have seen elsewhere, most notably in Afghanistan and in Iraq, the respect for an organized body of rule of law and for institutions is crucial to ongoing stability, security, economic development, social welfare, whatever the goods of governance are. That there is one constant in this revolution, and that is a lack of governance, of good governance. Syria has suffered from that almost since its full independence, certainly since the 1950s. And the Assads, of course, carried misgovernance to a level of a pure art form with their brutality. And yet they also provided a certain modicum of security for Syria's minorities, as a minority themselves, as a schism of Shia Islam. They had a certain common cause with other minorities, most notably Alawis, and of which the regime was from, and the Christian community, but the Kurds as well. The Kurdish community never felt really threatened by the Alawi regime. And it is a certain bet, and we should be interviewing you on this, Zaina, that among those minorities, there is a real fear and uncertainty of what's happening next. So the challenges are immense. Running Idlib is one thing. Trying to run a whole country is something very different. And it also remains to be seen that whether this coalition that brought the revolution is going to hang together in the post-revolutionary order.
Absolutely. I want to stay with you, Ambassador. What does the fall of the Assad regime mean for Iran's axis of resistance in the Levant, and its influence in the region?
Well, the notorious Shia crescent, of which we heard so much, extending from Iran through Iraq, through Syria and into Lebanon, has now been broken, clearly. Hezbollah was already greatly weakened in its confrontation with Israel and the fall of Damascus. And it's been interesting to me to note that the one foreign state that al-Jolani has referred to very negatively has been Iran. And of course, we saw the images of the Iranian embassy being ransacked in Damascus. So the strategic alliance that was a critical element of Iran's national security policy, literally since the Islamic Revolution, between Tehran and Damascus is now irretrievably broken. And that will have profound impact on Iran's ability to resupply Hezbollah in Lebanon, already in question because of the extraordinary defeat Hezbollah suffered at Israeli hands. So does that mean that the era of Iranian fomented terror and insurgency in the region is over? No, absolutely not by a long shot. But clearly their overall strategy has been greatly weakened. And it's important to remember, again, the sweep of history here. We've talked about that a bit in the Syrian context. It's also important to consider it in an Iranian context. Iran, since the time of Cyrus the Great, at least, has considered itself a regional superpower, an empire, if you will. And under the Shah, it displayed that power by projecting military force beyond its borders. through the Iranian Navy, which seized 3 islands from the newly created United Arab Emirates, beginning of the 1970s, to a deployment of a mechanized infantry brigade into Oman at the request of the Sultan to put down a communist-backed insurgency in the west of Oman. The message that the Shah was sending to the region was that beware of Iran. We have power, we will project it beyond our borders, and we will prevail. So the Islamic Revolution changed a lot of things, but it didn't change Iran's geopolitical strategic outlook. It continued to project power beyond its borders, but via unconventional means rather than conventional. So that is deeply rooted, I think, in Iran's sense of itself as a regional superpower. It is back-footed now, but that does not mean that Hezbollah is going to turn into a poetry reading society anytime soon. They will regroup, they will reorganize, they will rethink, but I think the overall strategic context for Iran in the region hasn't changed.
Charles, just to stay on the Iran topic, is this the end of Iran's ambitions in Syria, in your opinion?
I think the answer to that depends entirely on what happens next in Syria over the next 6 to 12 months. And at the moment, all of that is very unclear. No question, what's happened in the past 2 weeks is a potentially mortal blow to Iran's very long-standing, decades-long roots in Syria. And for Iran, Syria has been the jewel in the crown of its regional agenda. So without Syria, its entire regional agenda becomes much more challenged. So I really think, there's no understating the significance from Iran's strategic perspective of just how bad this recent development has been. But ultimately, if it's to remain that kind of mortal blow, Syria needs to enter into a period of calm and stability and a genuine transition that's accepted by its people, and not something that then ends up triggering a new chapter of civil strife, which I don't want to be pessimistic at this point, but isn't impossible by any means, given what's happening in Damascus right now. So it's difficult to say. I think all of the actors that are taking authority today are anti-Iran. And that obviously means that Iran's hands are tied in terms of wanting to be able to come back. And I think some of the developments, which perhaps we can come to talk about, but I mean, from a US perspective, our ability to exert influence in Syria right now is declining by the day, given developments in Deir ez-Zor in the northeast. And I think that's really significant, potentially from a US perspective, but that's a slightly different topic. But the forces that are changing those equations, again, are anti-Iran, explicitly anti-Iran. And if they are growing, then again, the challenge becomes more significant from Tehran's perspective.
Well, we're talking about outside influence. Ambassador Crocker, what about the role of Assad's former patron, Russia? Syria was Russia's only foothold in the Middle East, with its naval base in Tartus and air base in Hmeimim. How do you see Russia reacting to this sudden loss of its influence in Syria, and what leverage will Putin have in this changing Syria?
Well, like everything else we've been discussing, it remains to be seen. I think for the moment, both Russia and HTS recognize that neither needs a new struggle right now. We've seen the statements and indeed the actions on the part of HTS in areas adjacent to Russian military locations, indicating that they are not interested in a confrontation with Russia. Over the long term, it remains to be seen whether Russia will be able to maintain those bases, whether HTS will allow that on a de facto basis or will move to push the Russians out. If the latter course is chosen, Russia has some means at its disposal. It could conceivably fuel an Alawi insurgency in the mountains around Latakia, for example, and Tartus. So I think both sides will be at some pains to avoid a direct confrontation, at least in the short term. But it resolves nothing, except as Charles has pointed out with respect to Iran, it clearly signals a setback for Russia in the Middle East. although the extent of Russian influence in the region was, I think, pretty much overstated as it was, even before Ukraine and certainly since. But symbolically, at least, and more than symbolically, the Tartus is, in a sense, Russia's warm water port, and has been very important to its Mediterranean operations. So for both reasons of prestige, but also for national security, it will want to hang on to those bases. Will HTS and whatever emerges as a government in Damascus find that acceptable? Remains to be seen, but my guess is that neither side, as I said, seeks a confrontation, at least not at this stage.
All right, at this time, I'd like to open up the discussion to callers on the line. To ask a question, please use the raise hand function in Zoom or submit your question in writing via the Q&A chat box. Lieutenant General Negara has his hand raised.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Ambassador Charles, good to see you. Ambassador, it's been a long time since we've been together, but I always enjoy listening to your analysis of this complicated region, as I do with Charles. I've got a macro question that has a micro question in it. What happens with the Kurds, particularly the ones that are in Syria, and by extension, what happens with al-Hol?
Charles, you want to start?
Sure. So thanks, Mike. And you came to, I think, maybe what I was sort of hinting at a little earlier about the US implications here. So the Kurds or the SDF, to speak more broadly, are in a really tricky spot from recent developments. The SDF was always a kind of marriage of convenience between the dominant PYD-YPG leadership and various other minority groups in the north who will stick with the Kurds for now, but particularly with the Arab militias and factions that joined the SDF. That was always a marriage of convenience. And the balance of power has shifted definitively in the past 2 weeks. So in Deir ez-Zor right now, which is the heart of ISIS's resurgence, and that, by the way, is a whole nother subject for discussion here. Deir ez-Zor is currently being lost from the SDF. So the SDF expanded opportunistically, taking regime positions and the provincial capital about a week ago. But right now, all of the Arab tribal factions are announcing their defection from the SDF and joining the HTS-led coalition that advanced south from Aleppo. And that's literally just happened in the last hour. That's a killer blow for the SDF. So they will likely withdraw or sort of pull back to their core in Hasakeh and parts of northern Raqqa for now. But obviously the Turks will smell blood, which is why we're seeing significant fighting and the loss of Manbij and significant escalation around Kobani this morning. So the SDF is in a really tricky spot. And as a result of that, again, from a US and security perspective, we need to have very significant eyes, not just on how sustainable the US military deployment is, but what the hell's about to happen to these ISIS prisons and al-Hol. I heard about 36 hours ago that several of the smaller prison facilities holding ISIS fighters in Hasakeh were actually abandoned by the SDF. There's been little or no reporting around that, so I'm not completely clear as to their current status, but that trajectory is very worrying. The SDF has always made it very clear that if it felt pressed and that its survival was in question, those prisons and those camps will not be their priority. And if we do see them suddenly emptied, an already significant ISIS resurgence, which has seen them triple their rate of attacks in 2024 compared to 2023, will explode. And so, there's a very significant cause for concern on the ISIS side of this. And it will only be able to be contained if US troops stay on the ground, but US troops can only stay on the ground if their SDF partners remain viable. And at the moment, genuinely, that question is very much up in the air.
Ambassador Crocker, anything to add?
Well, great to hear from you, Mike. It's been a while. We should be interviewing you on this very subject. I think Charles has summed it up pretty neatly, and it underscores the incredible complexity of Syria and events within Syria as the future unspools here. That is, in the northeast, we have Arabs, we have ISIS, We have HTS, we have the Kurds, we have the Americans, and the Turks. That is just in one portion of Syria. And the potential for escalating conflict is huge. We've seen the liberation, if you will, of two notorious regime prisons at Tadmor and Sidnaya. Well, you have to consider that factions within the revolution, if not HTS itself, definitely have their eyes on al-Hol. That we may see it as a totally different situation. They may see it as exactly parallel. So I think it's a great question, Mike, to keep an eye on what happens at al-Hol. I agree completely with Charles that the Kurds in Syria are not going to make their last stand keeping al-Hol intact. And that, of course, raises a fundamental question for the United States. Since 9/11, our mission has been to ensure that al-Qaeda or any affiliated organization can never again have the space and the resources to plan and execute an attack on the American homeland. And al-Qaeda, now ISIS, has never given up that dream. And clearly they are poised to take advantage of the current disorder to strengthen their position if they possibly can. So, I took note, as did the world, of President-elect Trump's statement that the United States should stay out of this conflict. Well, we're already in it. With our support for the Kurds and our ongoing efforts against ISIS, we are very much there, and our ability to remain there and to prevent another resurgence of ISIS, I think, is very much in question.
Absolutely. We have another question from Howard LaFranchi. Howard wants to know, he wants you to address the U.S. role and influence in Syria going forward. We have about 40 days of the Biden administration, and President Biden pledged vigilance and cooperation with Syrian partners. And then we have the Trump administration, which we just talked about. Trump has already suggested that he has no interest in Syria and it's not our fight. Trump is interested in Iran, however. So how do you see U.S. short-term and long-term engagement in Syria? Let's start with Ambassador Crocker, and then we could get Charles' take.
Well, this is clearly a time for the closest possible consultation with our friends and allies in the region. And of course, we have good relations of varying strength all the way around Syria's borders with Turkey, with Iraq, with Jordan, with Israel, and we cannot forget Lebanon in this. That is also an unresolved issue going forward. So I think this is a time, if we want to avoid missteps or major surprises, for the closest possible consultations we can manage with our partners in the area to get their reading on the situation, but also to read their own intentions. Charles has touched on the thinking in Turkey. I would agree that this did not play out according to a Turkish script. Erdogan's comments at the end of last week, I think, made that clear. Yet Turkey has critical national security issues in Syria, particularly in the north, and vis-a-vis the Kurds. So we've got to take a reading from, again, all of the countries that border Syria that have a role to play there, both for their assessment and to get the best reading we can of their intentions going forward, which could be very contradictory to a long-term stable order arising in Syria. Within Syria, I would like to see us get something established on the ground in Damascus as soon as possible, a diplomatic presence. Yes, there are risks and there are uncertainties, but this is when there is a great need for what I would call expeditionary diplomacy. To influence events on the ground, you have to be on the ground. And to influence those events in a positive way, you've got to understand them. And right now, our ability to understand or to influence outside of the Northeast is severely limited. So I would argue that for both the incoming and the outgoing administration, this is a time to engage intensively with partners in the area and it is a time to think about how to establish a presence on the ground to influence events in Syria, or at least to read them more accurately than we can right now.
Charles?
So I would first start by just totally agreeing on that latter bit about, US engagement intensively, particularly with actors on the ground. And I think we've seen, there was a briefing a couple of days ago by a senior administration official that basically implied, and then subsequently a bunch of unnamed officials cited in the media, implying that the US is already indirectly communicating with HTS, but US also needs to be communicating with everybody else as fast as possible. Listen, the fact of the matter here is that the US has been completely caught flat-footed, as most of our allies have been as well, because we've been disengaging from the Syrian issue for years. Gathering from what I've been hearing from some officials, there's a total lack of understanding about the nature of many of these actors involved, what they're wanting, what they're trying to do. So as much communication as possible, as broadly and as widely as possible, will be the first step. Also totally agree on the need to get people on the ground. I know there's, obviously Ambassador Crocker knows this better than I do, but it's complicated. Was just in Doha a couple of days ago with all of the main international actors, and I put this directly to them. I said, you all need to be there on the ground, trying to make sure that whatever happens next doesn't go in the wrong direction. And they uniformly said, yeah, easier said than done. We might be able to do things from Beirut, but reopening embassies isn't necessarily first on our agenda. Italy has an embassy on the ground. Of course, Italy just recently re-established its embassy presence because they sought to normalize with Assad. But I gather the Italians have actually been almost the first to engage with this new HTS-led transitional government this morning. There's also just been a meeting earlier today involving officials from Iraq, Bahrain, Oman, Egypt, the UAE, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, a big multilateral with the HTS coalition, in which apparently almost every state has agreed to imminently establish recognition of this new transitional entity. That presents the US with a major dilemma, because technically speaking, the US and our European partners are and should be aligned with a UN-led process, a UN-led transitional governing body as dictated by Security Council Resolution 2254. The UN, through Special Envoy Geir Pedersen, is planning, as I believe as of last night still, a major Geneva-type process meeting in Geneva later this week. Now, if that happens, we're seeing two transitional processes in parallel, one at 100 miles an hour in Damascus and one at 5 miles per hour in Switzerland. And you need only guess, where things head in that perspective. The latter one in Geneva will be with the exiled political opposition, which, yes, maintain the official standing of the international community's recognition, but they are completely detached from what's happening inside Syria. And so trying to find a way to meet those two tracks together needs to be the utmost priority from a US perspective. If there's really a drive to do so, given the fact that, yes, we're 6 weeks out from a new administration, and there's only so much that this one will be able to do, especially having been caught as flat-footed as it has been on this.
We have another question from Teresa. Teresa says, I hear from good sources that 70% of Syrian armed forces were Hezbollah fighters. Were these Syrian nationals, and how much of the leadership in the army was directly connected to Iran? Charles, you want to take that one?
70% number seems a little wild to me, frankly. There was a thing as sort of Syrian Hezbollah, which was a force that Hezbollah and the IRGC had sought to recruit to be kind of Lebanese Hezbollah's front in Syria. So yes, that existed. But no, the vast majority of Syrian soldiers on the ground were conscripts. The elite forces, the 4th Division, the Republican Guard, and another force called the 25th Special Tasks Division, were the three kind of expeditionary forces that the regime would move around depending on its priority. But apart from that, it was a Syrian conscript force. Lebanese Hezbollah was on the front line in Western Aleppo on the first morning of the offensive. It took several casualties. So, by the way, were Russian special forces, who also took several casualties. But neither Hezbollah nor the Russians have had a significant frontline troop presence in Syria for many years. They have sort of forward positioned posts, yes, but they haven't had hundreds of thousands of fighters on the ground for a long time, with the one exception being along the Euphrates in Deir ez-Zor, where their front, really, frankly, was with us, the United States, not with the Syrian opposition. And so, you know, questions around, you know, why didn't they intervene more aggressively, or why didn't they have more of a difference on the battlefield, is a very simple answer: because they didn't really have that many people on the ground. That wasn't because of the war in Ukraine. It wasn't because of the war in Lebanon. That had long been the kind of long-standing reality on the ground, that they were relying primarily on the Syrian conscript military.
Charles, another question for you. The rebels are not only very highly coordinated and disciplined, but we're also witnessing a sophisticated PR strategy, particularly from Jolani. Is this all HTS, or is there some outside power involved?
I don't think there's outside powers involved in this. This is, listen, Jolani is pretty young, probably a couple years older than me. He's extremely ambitious. People, you know, who are aware of him, very well read, and he is hell bent on he becoming, as I said a little earlier, the Syrian kingmaker. And he has been on a single-minded mission since 2015 to get to this point, and has been very patient and very strategically pragmatic in getting there, but also very vicious when he has needed to be. He has purged his own group of any potential or active critics, which is part of the reason why he's been able to take these various rhetorical steps in the last couple of weeks without any internal consequences. If he had started reaching out to Christians and Alawites and talking about Syrian unity and flying the green flag of the revolution 8 years ago, he'd have been strung up by his own fighters. So a lot has happened internally within HTS over the last 8 years. Militarily, they've channeled an enormous amount of resources into training themselves. And they've shown that training off. Again, it hasn't been a secret. They've shown off the training camps. They've shown off their procedures. They've shown off the new units dedicated to nighttime fighting, special force type units, their drone faction and everything else. So none of this is a surprise either. The discipline has been very impressive, I have to say, as someone who's really specialized in the conflict side of the Syrian crisis over the last 13 years. For the vast majority of that time when there was open conflict, HTS and all of the other opposition factions, if they were engaged in major hostilities, they'd all be sort of tweeting out where they were, what the next front line was going to be, when the next offensive was going to happen. You know, Village A is going to be attacked at 8 o'clock, and, you know, essentially signaling everything they were about to do. What we saw happen in the week-long offensive this time around was that when a village or a town or a city district was captured, they didn't even announce the capture until about 6 hours after the fact, because they wanted to make sure it was consolidated before it was announced. So the messaging discipline was, I have to say, like complete tidal shift from what we had been used to before. But I think it's much less to do with any conspiracy around foreign actors being involved, and much more to do with the fact that whilst the Syrian army fragmented and the cause of the regime had decayed, the armed opposition collectively still had a single-minded goal, which was the defeat of the regime. They never gave up on that objective. And that allowed them to maintain the kind of cohesion and discipline that the other side frankly lacked very significantly, and that difference on the battlefield showed.
Ambassador Crocker, one of the challenges to resolving the Syrian crisis in 2011 was the lack of a viable replacement to Bashar al-Assad. Is this problem solved today?
Well, we're going to find out, aren't we? And I would say that right now we simply don't know. As Charles has outlined, HTS, under the leadership of al-Jolani, did a superb job in preparation and execution of the overthrow of the regime, aided, of course, by the regime itself through its massive corruption and hollowing out of its institutions and its forces. But taking power is one thing, consolidating it is something else, and consolidating it on a national level is very different than the challenge that HTS successfully managed in Idlib. So it remains to be seen. But what we have seen, I think, is that, again, Jolani has been extremely adept in his messaging and his media manipulation. But that doesn't really tell us much about what he truly intends. And it tells us even less about what he is capable of carrying out. What it does say, though, as Charles has outlined, is he is a very effective, very ruthless leader. And again, I would go back to my earlier point. It's easier to predict what isn't coming to Syria in the foreseeable future, and that is a rules-based order that respects the rights of all Syrian citizens, that offers protections and good services and good governance. That won't be coming. Whether there is an immediate possibility of at least security and stability in Syria's major cities, that might be a more achievable objective, but it is by no means a given. I'm afraid if I were pushed to forecast that over the next couple of weeks, that the scenes of jubilation that we're seeing today may not be present so much as the score settling sets in, as the jockeying for power, because that's what this is all about. It's about power. It is not about a rules-based order at this stage. We'll see how that plays out, whether the leadership that al-Jolani exercised so effectively in bringing down the regime is going to be up to the task of the far more difficult task of trying to consolidate and maintain power over the longer term.
Okay. We have a question from Jennifer Kirby for you, Charles. Can you talk a little about international sanctions on HTS? She's seen some reports that the US is trying to remove the designation, but might that remove leverage? How might these sanctions complicate recognition and international aid? Is the Taliban a fair comparison to HTS?
So all good questions. I think hard to know where to start because it's a complicated issue. I mean, first of all, removing a designation isn't something, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ambassador Crocker, but isn't something that can happen at the click of a button. It would be a long, drawn-out, conditional process in which HTS would be expected to meet a variety of concessions, one of which would be the hardest, which is probably some extent of accountability within its ranks for crimes committed in the past, whilst designated, and that will be a very significant challenge. My understanding is communication can technically take place, albeit not public and not fully official, whilst that group remains designated. And that's the kind of communication that I would say needs to be happening with HTS and everybody, all of the other involved factions and others as soon as possible. But realizing that it's complicated. Take note that a number of European countries, including the UK, I'll put my British hat on, also announced yesterday that the designation might require rethinking. So everyone is adapting to this. I think it's telling that we've been collectively so quick to even publicly imply that the designation could be rethought. I think that is telling because it probably implies that it may have required some rethinking in previous years, but we just haven't had a need to do that until now, when suddenly we're in crisis mode and needing to perhaps do more than we're able to legally. I mean, I forget if I said this on this call or the call I was on before, but you know, HTS leader Jolani has had a $10 million bounty on his head for a decade. Now, he's been walking around opening shopping malls, opening up all manner of highways and newly built highways and water supply tankers and everything else in Idlib for 4.5 years, whilst US drones have been flying over his head, and he's never been hit. He's never been targeted. What does that tell me? The designation on his head has been utterly meaningless for the last 5 years. So yes, perhaps the designation on HTS is also relatively blurry and has been for a long time to come too. But still, that sequenced conditional process will still need to happen. But in the interim, communication is needed. Do I think they're similar to the Taliban? No, I think it's a very different case. I mean, for a whole number of reasons, significant cultural differences, but also differences in terms of the nature of the individuals we're dealing with here. I think it should be acknowledged that the political negotiations with the Taliban that took place in Doha were with a political office that had largely been exiled for a number of years. They didn't have a great deal of connectivity with the guys on the guns inside the country. That's why we saw that sudden pivot from, yes, having a pragmatic posture during talks, suddenly switch to a much more aggressive posture in which human rights, women's rights, and all number of other rights have been squashed very quickly. With HTS, you're just dealing with the group on the ground from the get-go. And I think that is a difference that maybe makes the prospect of engaging with the group more simple. But ultimately we still have that question of it's easier to send all of the right signals amidst the euphoria of liberation and freedom. It will be a lot harder to keep those signals going once HTS starts to be challenged by minority groups, be issued demands by minority groups. And again, that is the reason why there is that urgent need for significant and intense engagement with HTS and everyone else to try to push this transition that they are leading in the right directions. If we don't, we all know where it's going to go, and it won't be truly representative. Our best chance of ensuring damage limitation is engaging it, not isolating it. And perhaps that's where the designation thing presents some challenges.
Charles, I know you have a hard stop at 11, so just a topic that we've touched on, but I just want to see if you have if you have a different assessment. Tom Charters wants to know, he wants to ask about the control of the naval base in Latakia. Is it going to remain in Russian control or not?
To be determined. So there has been HTS Russian communication around this and a number of other small Russian outposts that are still surrounded and contain Russian troops. I find it hard to imagine, despite all of the apparent pragmatism of HTS, that they'll ultimately be willing to allow the Russian military to maintain major military bases on Syrian soil, given the fact that those military bases have been precision striking hospitals for years and killing civilians on a weekly basis. There's no love lost between these two actors. Probably explains why the Russians have been willing to put up the Syrian revolutionary flag from the Syrian embassy in Moscow, and why Sergei Lavrov has been talking openly about the need to communicate with all groups, including HTS. So this sudden 180-degree flip is because the Russians really don't want to lose that warm water port and the very significant Khmeimim airport at the same time. But I think they'll stay there for the interim, but I can't see it lasting forever.
Right. Last question to Ambassador Crocker from Michael Thomas. Michael wants to know, with so many returning Syrians, what will sustain the economy enough to prevent recurring protests?
That is a critical question. In the initial phase, because we have seen a massive return of Syrian refugees, largely Sunni Muslims who no longer feel threatened by the new order, whatever it is. There's going to be a need for an intensive international humanitarian relief effort run through the United Nations. The mechanisms are there. The resources need to be put into them, and that needs to happen immediately. The longer-term issue of economic stability and development is also a critical one. I think one of the elements that we've both discussed that has led to the collapse so precipitously of the Bashar regime was a total economic collapse in Syria. And that was in turn a fueler of the 2011 uprisings, the dire economic conditions. So in addition to an immediate humanitarian assistance effort, there's got to be thought given to redeveloping a shattered economy, shattered both in a physical sense, but also in a regulatory sense. And again, this is going to require institutions, it's going to require initiatives, it's going to require stability, and it's going to require international support in that order. that what happens next is going to be determined by what happens on the ground. And that is as true for economic issues as it is for political insecurity.
Great, thank you,
I'd
everyone.
just say a 10-second thing here, just before we drop off, just to add to the ambassador's comments, is the fact that the region, the Arab and Gulf states, have been so swift to re-engage with HTS, despite their posture 2 weeks ago being precisely the opposite, I think speaks to the fact that they feel like there's an opportunity to accomplish what they've always wanted to accomplish, which is switching Syria from being a state within the axis of resistance and a loyal ally of Iran to being precisely the opposite. I don't think any of these governments see HTS as a reliable partner, let alone as an ally, but I think they see an opportunity to economically suddenly surge money into Syria and prop up something that they will then be able to influence. And I think that's what we're seeing very literally as of this morning, the very first stage of a Arab-led effort to shape what comes next. And that's, I guess, an opportunity for the US as well as a potential risk.
Well, thank you everyone for the great questions. We're going to wrap things up now. I hope you will join me in thanking Ambassador Ryan Crocker and Charles Lister for participating in this week's session. We really appreciate your invaluable insights and your contributions. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Zaina.
Thanks, Zaina.
Bye.